The wind howled through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks that loomed over Ravenshade's cemetery, their twisted limbs clawing at the starless sky. It was a forgotten place, perched on the edge of town, abandoned by all but the dead and those who sought them. Tonight, the cemetery seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the cracked headstones casting elongated shadows that danced eerily under the flickering light of a single, rusted lamppost. Ellie hadn't wanted to come here. The cemetery was a relic of nightmares, a place whispered about in hushed tones at the local diner. But when her friends dared her to prove she wasn't scared of the so-called Wailing Widow, she couldn't refuse. It was a legend everyone in Ravenshade knew, a spectral figure who mourned at midnight, her cries weaving through the graves like a cursed lullaby. Some said she lured the living into her cold embrace, never to be seen again. Armed with nothing but her phone flashlight, Ellie crossed the cemetery's creaking iron gate. The sound echoed in the stillness, too loud, as if the air itself recoiled from her presence. Her friends had stayed back by the car, their laughter fading into the distance. "Just 10 minutes," she muttered to herself, trying to stave off the rising tide of unease. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick blanket of fallen leaves that muffled her footsteps. The graves were a chaotic assortment of slabs, crosses, and statues, some tilted at odd angles as if trying to escape the earth. Her flashlight's narrow beam illuminated a path ahead, but the surrounding darkness seemed to press in, heavy and suffocating. Halfway through, Ellie paused. There it was, a sound, faint and distant, but unmistakable. A low, keening wail that sent shivers racing down her spine. She turned in a slow circle, the beam of her flashlight darting from one shadow to the next. The sound grew louder, more desperate, and she couldn't tell if it was coming from behind her or ahead. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling despite her attempt at bravado. The wailing stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it made her ears ring. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath visible in the frigid air. The cemetery seemed to shift around her, the graves closer than they had been moments ago. Panic clawed at her throat, and she decided it was time to leave. She turned back the way she came, but froze mid-step. The path was gone. What had been a clear route was now an endless expanse of graves, their inscriptions too eroded to read. A thick mist began to seep from the ground, curling around her ankles like icy fingers. The lamppost that had marked the cemetery's entrance was nowhere to be seen. Her phone's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled with it, heart pounding, but no amount of tapping could bring it back to life. That's when she heard the crunch of footsteps, not hers. Ellie spun around, straining to see through the gloom. A shadow moved among the graves, too tall and too thin to be human. It glided rather than walked, its movements jerky and unnatural. Her chest tightened as the wailing began again, louder now, accompanied by a whispering chorus that seemed to come from every direction. Ellie. The voice was raspy, elongated, and unmistakably calling her name. Her legs finally obeyed her, and she ran, stumbling over roots and fallen headstones. The air grew thicker with each step, as though the mist itself were trying to hold her back. The whispers grew louder, an unintelligible cacophony that drowned out her ragged breaths. She tripped and fell hard, her palms scraping against the jagged edge of a broken gravestone. Pain shot through her hands, but she barely noticed. Ahead of her, the mist parted, revealing a figure standing beneath a gnarled tree. It was a woman in a tattered black gown, her face obscured by a veil. The Wailing Widow. Ellie scrambled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. The widow raised a hand, skeletal and pale, pointing directly at her. The wailing ceased, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Then, the woman's head tilted unnaturally to one side, and Ellie saw what lay beneath the veil. A hollow, gaping void where a face should have been. Ellie screamed, her voice breaking as she clawed at the ground, trying to put distance between her and the apparition. The widow began to move toward her, gliding over the graves with impossible speed. "Stay away!" Ellie shrieked, but the widow showed no sign of stopping. Just as the specter reached her, Ellie's hand brushed against something cold and metallic, the rusted gate latch. She didn't question how she had gotten back to the entrance. She simply flung herself through and slammed the gate shut behind her. The wailing erupted once more, furious and deafening, as the widow grasped the iron bars. Her bony fingers burned into the metal, leaving charred marks as she screeched. Ellie stumbled backward, her vision blurring with tears. The The specter reached through the bars, but as her fingers passed the threshold, they disintegrated into ash. The wailing stopped, and the widow dissolved into the mist, leaving only the faint echo of her cries. Ellie staggered back to the car, where her friends were waiting, their laughter dying the moment they saw her pale, tear-streaked face. "What happened?" one of them asked, but she couldn't speak. She simply climbed into the car, clutching her scraped hands as they drove away. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The widow's hollow visage haunted her every time she closed her eyes. When dawn finally broke, she noticed something strange. Dark, charred marks on her wrists, shaped like skeletal fingers. The marks never faded. Over the years, she noticed the wailing followed her wherever she went, soft at first, then growing louder as the nights grew longer. The widow had claimed her once, and it was only a matter of time before she came back to finish what she'd started. The fog rolled into Briar Hollow like an uninvited guest, smothering the streets and curling around the dilapidated remains of St. Mary's Church. Perched on the hill like a crumbling sentinel, its cemetery was a labyrinth of overgrown weeds, toppled headstones, and whispers of the past. Local legend warned that anyone who entered the graveyard after midnight would never leave. They called it the Hollowing. It was precisely this tale that lured Mia and her friends there on Halloween night. Mia wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but the thrill of it was irresistible. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they crept through the rusted iron gates, their laughter bouncing off the cold, damp stones. The graveyard was deathly quiet. No crickets chirped, no breeze rustled the brittle leaves. Even the distant hum of the town below seemed to fade into nothingness. Mia's flashlight beam skimmed across an angel statue, its face weathered into an expression of anguish. The hollow socket seemed to follow her as she moved. "Okay, 10 minutes, then we're out," said Tyler, trying to mask the quaver in his voice. 10 minutes? Scoffed Sarah. "We came all the way up here for 10 minutes? We should." A faint sound interrupted her. A low, guttural moan drifted through the fog. The group froze, their breath hitching. Mia's stomach nodded, but she forced a grin. "It's just the wind," she said, though the sound had no natural cadence. It was too deliberate, too pained. "No way that's the wind," Tyler muttered, his eyes darting nervously. "Let's just go to the old crypt and get a picture," Mia urged. "Prove we were here, and then we can leave." She didn't wait for an answer, turning toward the crypt that loomed at the cemetery's heart. As they walked, the air grew colder. Their footsteps crunched loudly on the gravel path, but the sound didn't echo. Instead, it seemed to be swallowed by the fog. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, vanishing when they turned to look. When they reached the crypt, Mia hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of impenetrable darkness beckoning from within. She didn't remember hearing anyone else mention an open crypt in the stories, and the sight unsettled her. "We're not going in there," Sarah whispered, her earlier bravado gone. "Scared?" Tyler taunted, though his voice cracked. "Let's just take the picture," Mia said quickly, raising her phone. The flash illuminated the scene for a split second. The moss-covered entrance, the ancient carvings on the stone, and the black void beyond the doorway. And something else. Mia's hand trembled as she checked the photo. Her heart plummeted. In the doorway stood a figure, its form twisted and wrong. Its limbs were too long and its posture bent as though it had been broken and reassembled. Its eyes glowed faintly, pale and lifeless. "What is it?" Sarah asked, leaning over Mia's shoulder. Her scream pierced the night when she saw the image. Before they could react, the crypt door creaked open wider. The moan from earlier returned, louder and closer. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of shuffling steps. "Run!" Tyler shouted, but the moment they turned, the fog thickened, enveloping them. The path they had taken moments ago was gone, replaced by a maze of gravestones and thorny brambles that tore at their clothes and skin. The whispers began then, low, murmuring voices in a language they didn't understand. They surrounded the group, growing louder, more insistent. Sarah clutched Mia's arm, her nails digging in painfully. "What's happening?" she whimpered. "I don't know," Mia shouted, her own fear threatening to choke her. The fog coalesced ahead of them, forming shapes, faces. Gaunt, hollow-eyed visages emerged, their mouths moving in silent screams. Hands stretched from the mist, clawing at their clothing, pulling them toward the graves. Tyler yanked his arm free from a ghostly grip and bolted into the dark. "Tyler, wait!" Mia called, but he disappeared into the fog. Moments later, his scream tore through the silence, abruptly cut off. Sarah began to sob, her knees buckling. Mia tried to pull her up, but the ground beneath them shifted. The earth grew soft, and their feet sank into it as if the graveyard itself were swallowing them. "Help me!" Sarah shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. Mia grabbed her arms, pulling with all her strength, but Sarah was sinking too fast. Her hands slipped, and with a final blood-curdling scream, Sarah was gone, the ground closing over her as though she had never existed. Mia stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face. She turned and ran blindly, the fog parting just enough to lead her to a towering oak tree. She collapsed against it, her chest heaving. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She dared to look around. The graveyard was empty. The crypt was gone. The angel statue from earlier now stood in front of her, its hollow eyes fixed on hers. A hand clamped down on her shoulder. Mia screamed, spinning around to see Tyler. Relief washed over her for a moment until she saw his face. His eyes were wide and lifeless, his mouth stretched into a rictus grin. "Mia," he rasped, his voice layered with another, deeper tone. "You shouldn't have come." The ground beneath her split open, and skeletal hands erupted, dragging her down. Tyler watched, his expression unchanging, as the fog swallowed her screams. When the sun rose the next morning, the graveyard was empty. The iron gates were closed, the crypt sealed tight. Mia, Tyler, and Sarah were never found. But the legend of St. Mary's grew. Some nights, if you listen closely, you can hear their screams mingling with the whispers, warning others to stay away from Briar Hollow. No one listens. The small town of Black Hollow was quiet and unassuming, nestled deep in a forest that seemed older than time itself. But there was one place everyone avoided: Ashwood Cemetery. The locals whispered of strange occurrences, shadows moving without light, voices calling from the darkness, and the oppressive feeling that you were never truly alone. Despite the warnings, Ethan found himself standing at its wrought iron gates one moonless night. The cemetery was his final test of courage, the dare that would seal his reputation among his group of friends. All he had to do was enter, find the grave of William Blackthorne, and take a photo to prove he'd been there. Easy, he muttered to himself, trying to mask the fear creeping into his voice. The gate groaned loudly as he pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a scream. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The flashlight in his hand cast long, trembling beams across the uneven rows of headstones. Many were cracked and weathered, their inscriptions eroded into illegible whispers. The graves seemed to lean toward him, as if listening, waiting. He checked his phone for the map his friends had sent. "Row 13, grave 7, he read aloud, his voice shaky. His breath misted in the cold night air as he started down the gravel path. The deeper he ventured, the quieter the world became. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of the town, just the crunch of his footsteps and the rhythmic thud of his heartbeat. A faint rustling noise made him stop. He turned the flashlight toward the sound, his breath catching. A shadow flitted between the trees at the cemetery's edge, too large for an animal, too fast for a person. "Just my imagination," he muttered, forcing himself to move forward. The path twisted and turned, the graves growing older and more elaborate. Stone angels with missing heads, mausoleums covered in thick ivy, and statues of mourners frozen in eternal grief. Finally, he found it. William Blackthorne, 1843 to 1891. The grave was marked by an ornate cross, its edges chipped and worn. Ethan snapped a photo with his phone, the flash briefly illuminating the surrounding area. In that fleeting moment, he saw something, or thought he did. A figure standing a few rows back, motionless, shrouded in darkness. "Who's there?" he called, his voice breaking. No answer. His flashlight darted across the graves, revealing nothing but shadows. His stomach churned as he realized how far from the gate he was. Turning back, he quickened his pace, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. But no matter how fast he walked, the air grew heavier, the darkness denser. The trees at the cemetery's edge seemed to close in, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, just behind him. "Ethan!" He spun around, the flashlight shaking in his grip. There was no one there, but the voice had been unmistakable. It was low and raspy, like wind scraping over dry leaves. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time from a different direction. "Ethan!" The flashlight flickered, the bulb dimming. Panic surged through him as he smacked it against his hand, trying to keep it alive. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, their shapes too human, too close. "Stop it!" he yelled, breaking into a run. The path was gone, replaced by a chaotic maze of headstones and statues. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled over roots and uneven ground. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming an unintelligible chorus. His name was among them, woven into the cacophony. The flashlight died completely, plunging him into darkness. Blindly, he reached out, his hands brushing against cold stone. The air around him shifted, carrying the unmistakable sensation of being watched. A sudden burst of light illuminated the graveyard, a pale, ghostly glow emanating from the fog that now blanketed the ground. In the eerie light, he saw them. Figures standing among the graves, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They stared at him with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind racing. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. But the figures began to move, gliding toward him with unnatural grace. Their shadows stretched across the ground, reaching for him. He turned and ran, his legs burning as he pushed himself faster than he thought possible. The whispers were deafening now, filling his ears, his mind. The gate came into view, a jagged outline in the fog. Relief surged through him as he sprinted toward it, his hands outstretched. But just as he reached it, something grabbed his ankle. He fell hard, the breath knocked out of him. He kicked wildly, his foot connecting with something cold and unyielding. Turning, he saw a skeletal hand emerging from the ground, its bony fingers wrapped around his leg. "No!" he screamed, clawing at the ground as more hands emerged, pulling him down. The ghostly figures loomed over him, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The whispers became a single voice, deep and guttural. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan's screams echoed through the cemetery as he was dragged beneath the earth. The fog thickened, swallowing the sound, and the graveyard fell silent once more. When his friends returned the next morning to look for him, they found nothing but his flashlight lying at the cemetery gate. No footprints, no sign he had ever been there. But on William Blackthorne's grave, fresh soil covered the ground as though it had been disturbed, and carved into the weathered stone was a single chilling message: "Welcome to the Hollow." The moon hung low and pale in the sky over Hollow Creek Cemetery, casting an eerie glow over the sea of ancient graves. The cemetery was notorious, not just for its age, but for the unsettling tales whispered in the surrounding town. People spoke of the Echo Keeper, a spectral entity said to roam the grounds, luring the curious with their own voices. Nina didn't believe in ghosts. At least, that's what she told herself as she tightened her jacket against the biting wind. Her younger brother, Ben, had dared her to retrieve an artifact from the cemetery, a broken locket said to be buried near the caretaker's shed. It was supposed to prove her bravery and earn her a reputation as the fearless sibling. Armed with a flashlight and a spade, she pushed open the cemetery gates, which groaned on their hinges like a warning. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of moss and decaying leaves. Shadows stretched long and ominous over the cracked tombstones, their shapes too fluid, too alive. The caretaker's shed sat at the far end of the cemetery, half hidden by a cluster of gnarled trees. Nina's flashlight swept across the graves as she walked, illuminating names long faded by time. Her steps faltered when she thought she heard something, a faint shuffle, like feet dragging over stone. She stopped and turned, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, though her voice sounded small and uncertain. The shed came into view, its roof sagging and its windows dark. She approached cautiously, her flashlight picking out the disturbed earth of a small, shallow grave nearby. This was it, the place where the locket was rumored to be hidden. She knelt down and started digging, the spade biting into the cold, wet soil. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the scrape of metal against dirt. Finally, her spade struck something hard. She reached into the hole and pulled out a tarnished silver locket, its hinge rusted shut. A chill ran through her as she turned it over in her hands. The air seemed heavier now, pressing down on her shoulders. Then she heard it. "Nina?" She froze. The voice was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably her own. It drifted on the wind, curling around her like icy tendrils. "Nina, help me." Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she turned her flashlight toward the source of the sound. The beam fell on empty graves, their stones leaning like crooked teeth. The voice came again, closer this time. "Nina, Over here. The words were identical to how she'd said them earlier when she'd called to herself for reassurance. Panic gripped her as she realized what she was hearing. Her own voice, mimicked perfectly, but laced with a hollow, otherworldly resonance. She grabbed the locket and stuffed it into her pocket, rising to her feet. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The cemetery answered with silence. She started back toward the gate, her pace quickening. The path seemed longer now, the graves unfamiliar. Shadows loomed taller, their movements unnatural. Then, just ahead, her flashlight caught something in its beam. A figure standing among the graves. It was a woman, or at least something that resembled one. Her dress was tattered and gray, blending with the mist that clung to the ground. Her face was obscured by a veil, but her head tilted as if studying Nina. She raised a hand, pointing toward her. "Nina, come closer." The voice was hers again, but distorted, stretched. Nina stumbled back, her flashlight shaking as she directed it away from the figure. When she turned, the path was gone, replaced by a dense cluster of graves that hadn't been there for. The whispers began then, rising from the shadows around her. "Give it back! Nina, it's ours!" The voices overlapped, blending into a cacophony that filled her ears and sent shivers racing down her spine. She clutched the locket, its metal cold against her skin. Her breathing grew shallow as the whispers coalesced into laughter, mocking, inhuman. The figure was behind her now. She could feel it. The air was heavy with its presence, the cold seeping into her bones. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight beam trembling as it landed on the woman. Her veil was gone. What lay beneath was a face twisted and wrong, hollow eyes burning with a pale, unnatural light. Her mouth stretched into an impossible grin, revealing jagged teeth that gleamed like shards of glass. "Stay," the Echo Keeper rasped, her voice now a monstrous amalgamation of Nina's own. Nina screamed and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she bolted through the cemetery. The laughter followed her, echoing and multiplying, her own voice twisted into a horrifying chorus. The graves seemed to shift and move, blocking her path, forcing her deeper into the cemetery's heart. Finally, she saw the gate. Relief surged through her as she sprinted toward it, her lungs burning and her legs numb. But just as she reached it, the ground beneath her gave way. She fell hard, her ankle twisting painfully as the locket flew from her pocket and landed several feet away. She crawled toward it, her fingers scrabbling in the dirt. The Echo Keeper's laughter grew louder, closer. Shadows loomed over her, their shapes writhing and shifting. Just as her fingers closed around the locket, icy hands grabbed her wrists, pinning her to the ground. The Echo Keeper leaned down, her hollow eyes locking onto Nina's. "You took what wasn't yours," she hissed, her voice now a chorus of the cemetery's whispers. Nina's scream was cut short as the earth opened beneath her, swallowing her whole. The locket clattered to the ground, its tarnished surface catching the faint glow of the moon. When Ben came to the cemetery the next day, he found the gates closed and locked, the path undisturbed. There was no sign of Nina. But near the caretaker's shed, he found a single object lying in the dirt, a tarnished silver locket, its hinge creaking open to reveal a photo of a woman with hollow staring eyes. The road to Ravenshade Cemetery was almost as infamous as the place itself. Known as the Vale's Path, it twisted through a dense forest where moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving travelers in an eerie gloom. For decades, locals told stories of people who entered the cemetery and never returned. But for Claire, those tales were nothing more than folklore. She parked her car at the edge of the cemetery, her headlights cutting through the thick mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. She was here on a dare, urged by her thrill-seeking friends to spend an hour inside Ravenshade and record her experience. It was supposed to be a harmless prank. The iron gates loomed ahead, their ornate design marred by rust and overgrowth. Pushing them open, she winced at the groaning sound they made, as if protesting her presence. Her phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of crumbling headstones and skeletal trees. The air was cold, biting through her jacket, and carried a faint metallic scent. "Just an hour," she whispered, trying to reassure herself. The cemetery seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of the night conspicuously absent. No insects, no rustling leaves, just a silence so thick it pressed against her ears. She ventured deeper, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The headstones grew older and more ornate, covered in moss and strange symbols she didn't recognize. One in particular caught her attention, a towering obelisk, etched with a name that had been weathered beyond recognition. At its base was a small stone urn, cracked and empty. A sudden rustle made her spin around, her flashlight beam darting wildly. She caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flitting between the trees. Her breath hitched as she strained to see. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but the shadow returned, darting across her peripheral vision. Her heart raced as she tried to convince herself it was just an animal. She continued walking, each step heavier than the last. The deeper she went, the more the cemetery seemed to change. The mist thickened, clinging to her legs, and the headstones tilted at unnatural angles as though leaning toward her. She checked her phone. Only 15 minutes had passed. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a face reflected in it, hollow-eyed and grinning. She dropped the phone in panic, the flashlight beam casting wild, erratic shadows. "Pull it together," she muttered, scooping up her phone. When she turned the flashlight back on, her blood ran cold. The path she had been following was gone. She spun around, trying to get her bearings, but the cemetery seemed to have shifted. The graves now surrounded her in a haphazard maze, their inscriptions glowing faintly in the dark. Whispers began to rise, soft at first, like the wind threading through the trees. "Claire! Claire!" The sound sent shivers racing down her spine. It was her name, spoken by voices that were too familiar. She turned in a circle, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, forming a cacophony of distorted echoes. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. A figure stepped out from behind a tombstone, a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in funeral clothes from a bygone era. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes burned with a dim, otherworldly light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered with the whispers. "I am leaving," Claire stammered, stepping back. The man tilted his head, a slow, unnatural motion, and smiled, a wide, predatory grin that stretched too far. "Once you enter, you belong to the soil," he said. The ground beneath her shifted, softening like quicksand. Claire stumbled, her feet sinking into the earth. She screamed and pulled herself free, running blindly through the mist. The graves seemed to rise up around her, their stones forming walls that funneled her toward a single, towering mausoleum. The door to the mausoleum was ajar, darkness spilling out like ink. As she hesitated, the whispers surged, now joined by footsteps, slow, deliberate, and closing in. With no other choice, she darted inside, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. Her flashlight revealed a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The whispers were muffled but persistent, pressing against the walls like they were alive. "Just stay here," she told herself. "Wait out the hour." But then she heard it, a faint sound like crying coming from below. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay put, she descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The crying grew louder, more desperate. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Are you hurt?" She reached the bottom of the stairs, finding herself in a small circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves holding urns and bones, and in the center stood a woman with her back to Claire. The woman's shoulders heaved as she sobbed, her long hair tangled and wet. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, stepping closer. The woman stopped crying. Slowly, unnaturally, she turned her head to look at Claire without moving her body. Her face was a mask of decay, her empty eye sockets dripping shadows. Her mouth opened wide, wider than should have been possible, and a guttural scream tore through the chamber. Claire turned and ran, the woman's screams echoing behind her. The stairs seemed endless, twisting and narrowing as if the mausoleum itself were alive. When she finally burst through the door, the cemetery was unrecognizable. The mist had thickened into a suffocating fog, and the graves stood like sentinels, their inscriptions glowing brighter. The gaunt man was waiting for her. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice reverberating through the air. "I'm not staying," she shouted, darting past him toward the direction of her car. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the ground shook beneath her feet. She reached the gates and shoved them open, stumbling onto the road. Her car was there, headlights still on. She climbed in, slamming the door and starting the engine. The cemetery loomed in her rearview mirror, its gates now closed. She drove in silence, her hands trembling on the wheel. When she reached the edge of town, she pulled over to catch her breath. Checking her phone, she saw the recording she had started before entering Ravenshade. She pressed play. The video was shaky, showing her walk through the cemetery. But something was wrong. In the background, following her every step, was the gaunt man, his glowing eyes fixed on her. The last frame was her own face, staring into the camera, whispering, "You shouldn't have left." The town of Duskwood had always harbored secrets. Nestled deep within a fog-shrouded valley, it was a place where superstition wasn't just belief, it was survival. At the heart of these tales was Grimrose Cemetery, a sprawling graveyard that seemed to breathe with its own sinister life. Locals avoided it at all costs, warning outsiders with hushed tones, "Do not visit Grimrose after midnight. That's when the feeders wake." Lena had heard the warnings but dismissed them as baseless folklore. A freelance photographer with a fascination for the macabre, she sought out places like Grimrose for her portfolio. So, armed with her camera, she entered the cemetery at precisely 1 minute past midnight. The iron gate creaked shut behind her, the sound lingering in the heavy air. A full moon peeked through a thin veil of clouds, casting pale light over the gravestones. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cobblestone path, and each one seemed to summon a silence so oppressive it felt alive. Her camera clicked as she captured the intricate carvings on the headstones, some bearing names so faded they were barely legible. Statues of angels with broken wings loomed over the graves, their faces cracked and hollow-eyed. She felt a chill, not just from the cold, but from the uncanny feeling that she wasn't alone. Suddenly, her camera froze. The screen went blank, and a low hum vibrated through the air. She tapped the device in frustration, but it refused to power on. As she fiddled with it, she heard it, a faint rustling, like dry leaves scraping against stone. It came from behind her. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, turning back to the path. But the air was still, unnaturally so. She continued walking, her pace quickening, the rustling now persistent, growing closer. She turned abruptly, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. The beam landed on a figure standing several rows back, partially obscured by a tilted gravestone. It was hunched and humanoid, its pale skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. It stared at her with hollow sockets, empty yet somehow aware. Lena's breath caught. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but seemed to grow darker, its edges bleeding into the shadows around it. Then, with impossible speed, it darted behind another gravestone and vanished. Her heart pounded as she backed away, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. She told herself it was an animal, her overactive imagination, or even a prank. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. She decided to leave. The path back to the gate seemed longer now, winding through rows of graves she didn't remember passing. The mist thickened, curling around her legs like ghostly hands. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, flickering in and out like dying candle flames. A low, guttural sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a growl, faint at first, but rising into a deep, throaty snarl. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling as she scanned the darkness. They were everywhere. Dozens of the creatures now emerged from the shadows, their gaunt forms creeping forward with an unsettling insect-like precision. Their faces were featureless save for mouths that stretched impossibly wide, lined with jagged teeth that glinted in the moonlight. Lena screamed and ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she sprinted down the uneven path. The creatures followed, their movements unnaturally fast and silent except for the rasping growls that filled the air. She reached the gate and shoved it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. Her shaking hands fumbled with the lock, which was now rusted shut despite being pristine when she entered. Panic surged as she looked back. The creatures had stopped, lingering just beyond the reach of the moonlight. They stood still, watching, waiting. Then, one stepped forward. It moved with an eerie grace, tilting its head as if studying her. As it approached the moonlight, its shadow stretched unnaturally long, reaching her feet before the creature itself did. Its raspy breath filled her ears, and she froze, too terrified to move. The creature's mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing a dark void inside. A sound escaped it, a chilling mimicry of her own voice. "Stay," it whispered. The single word stretched and distorted. Lena stumbled back, clawing at the gate. Her nails broke against the iron, her hands bleeding as she screamed for help. The creatures began to close in, their shadows pooling around her like liquid night. Just as she thought she'd be swallowed by them, a deafening toll rang out, the sound of a church bell, deep and resonant. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. They hissed in unison, a grating noise that reverberated through the cemetery before retreating into the mist. Lena collapsed against the gate, her chest heaving. The bell tolled again, and this time she saw its source. A cloaked figure standing near a crumbling chapel at the far edge of the cemetery. The figure held a lantern, its dim light cutting through the fog. "Leave now," the figure called, its voice echoing unnaturally, "before they return." The gate creaked open with a loud groan, and Lena didn't hesitate. She stumbled through it, not daring to look back. When she reached her car, she found it covered in deep scratches, as though clawed by something large. She didn't stop to examine it. She drove away, tears streaming down her face, the growls of the creatures still echoing in her ears. Back in town, she tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. Grimrose Cemetery, they said, had been abandoned for years. The chapel she described had burned down a century ago, leaving nothing but rubble. Her camera was found days later by a group of hikers lying just inside the cemetery gates. The memory card was intact, but every photo was the same. A pale figure standing among the graves, its hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. In the remote town of Black Hollow, hidden in a valley shrouded by dense woods, there stood an unassuming, overgrown plot of land that locals called the Restless Acre. It wasn't marked on any map, and no official records acknowledged its existence, yet everyone in the town knew of its sinister reputation. The Restless Acre wasn't just a burial ground, it was a trap for those who sought answers where none should tread. It was this very infamy that drew Arthur, an amateur paranormal investigator, to Black Hollow. He'd made a name for himself debunking ghost stories, but the Restless Acre was a challenge he couldn't resist. The rumors were too outlandish to be true. People claimed that if you walked into the cemetery after dark, you'd feel the earth beneath you shift as though the graves themselves were alive. Arthur arrived just before midnight, the only light coming from his lantern and the weak crescent moon overhead. The entrance to the cemetery was barely noticeable, concealed behind a tangled mess of vines and thorn bushes. As he stepped through, the air changed, denser, colder. The world beyond the entrance felt muted, as though he had stepped into a bubble where sound dared not intrude. The gravestones were crude, jagged stones sticking out of the earth like broken teeth. None bore names, only strange symbols etched deep into their surfaces. Arthur knelt by one of the stones, running his fingers over the carvings. They looked old, ancient even, but unfamiliar. "This is nothing," he whispered to himself, forcing a laugh. "Just old rocks and stories." He set up his equipment, an EMF meter, a thermal camera, and an audio recorder. He spoke into the recorder, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. November 19th, 12:03 a.m. The site is completely silent, no signs of. The ground trembled beneath him, cutting him off mid-sentence. Arthur froze, his heart racing as he scanned the area. The cemetery was still. He chalked it up to his imagination until it happened again, this time stronger, a faint vibration that felt disturbingly alive. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, as though something deep beneath the ground was trying to break free. He swept the area with his flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick, creeping mist that was now curling through the graveyard. The thumping grew louder, closer, and with it came an unnatural warmth rising from the soil. Arthur's EMF meter spiked, its lights flashing erratically. He grabbed his recorder. "I'm experiencing seismic activity localized to this area." The ground, a groan, deep and guttural, interrupted him. It didn't come from the earth, but from the shadows between the gravestones. Arthur swung his flashlight in the direction of the sound, and there, just beyond the edge of the light, something moved. It wasn't human. The figure was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and its joints bent at wrong angles. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched taut over its bones, and its eyes, empty hollows that seemed to drink in the light, locked onto Arthur. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. What is that?" he whispered, though no one could hear him. The creature moved closer, not walking but gliding, its feet never touching the ground. As it did, the earth around Arthur began to shift, the graves undulating like waves on a dark sea. He turned to run, but the cemetery had changed. The entrance was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of gravestones that seemed to stretch into the horizon. The mist thickened, coiling around his legs and slowing him down. He felt the ground soften beneath him, the soil sucking at his boots like quicksand. The thumping was deafening now, reverberating through his entire body. A voice broke through the chaos, raspy and layered as though spoken by many throats at once. Stay. Stay and rest. Arthur whipped around. The creature was closer now, its bony hand outstretched, beckoning. Behind it, other shapes emerged, twisted, malformed figures crawling out of the earth. They didn't have faces, only smooth expanses of skin where their features should have been, and their bodies jerked unnaturally as they moved. He ran, his lungs burning as he pushed through the fog. The ground beneath him shifted and cracked, skeletal hands clawing their way out of the soil, grasping at his ankles. He kicked and stumbled, his flashlight slipping from his grip and plunging him into near-total darkness. Panic consumed him. He didn't care where he was going as long as it was away from the creatures. But the cemetery seemed endless, a labyrinth of shifting graves and grasping shadows. Every time he thought he was gaining ground, the path twisted back on itself, leading him closer to the center. The thumping stopped. Arthur skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. The silence was worse than the noise, a void that pressed in on him like a physical weight. Then, from somewhere ahead, he saw a faint light. It flickered weakly, like a dying flame, but it was enough to draw him forward. He reached the source, a single grave, larger than the rest, with a lantern placed at its base. The symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Before he could react, the earth beneath the grave erupted, and something massive began to rise. It was the source of the thumping, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and bone, its form constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. Faces pressed against its surface, mouths opening in silent screams before sinking back into the mass. Arthur fell to his knees, paralyzed by terror. The creature loomed over him, its many faces turning toward him in unison. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. You sought us, and now you belong. The mist surged forward, enveloping Arthur completely. He screamed, but no sound escaped as the ground opened beneath him, swallowing him whole. When dawn broke over Black Hollow, the restless acre was quiet once more. The cemetery looked undisturbed, its graves as still and unremarkable as they had always been. Arthur's equipment was found near the entrance, coated in a thin layer of dirt. No one ever saw Arthur again. But sometimes, on foggy nights, locals swear they hear a faint thumping coming from the direction of the cemetery, like the heartbeat of something waiting beneath the soil.